Hello everyone. Today we are going to start lecture 02 of class 8 mathematics chapter number 10, which is visualizing solid shapes. Now in this lecture we are going to talk about prisms. As we already studied that what are polyhedron, and we know that prism is a kind of polyhedron. So let us talk about what is a prism and how many types of prism do we have. Let us see all of their figures and all the specifications, like what are the edges, what are the faces, how many faces do a certain type of prism have, what is a right prism, what is a regular prism, and all of that. So starting with the definition of prism, a prism is a solid. Obviously it is a 3D figure, right? A prism is a solid whose side faces, a prism is a solid whose side faces are parallelograms. Okay, parallelograms means they can be rhombus, they can be rectangle, they can be squares. Okay, are parallelograms and whose ends, or you can say bases, like there is no top, we call both of them as bases, are congruent parallel rectilinear figures. That is basically planar figures, right? It can be again polygon, it can be triangle. Okay, on the basis of those only we are going to divide prism into certain categories. So what is a prism? A prism is a solid, right, whose side faces are parallelogram. That is, we will also call them lateral faces later on, whose side faces are parallelograms and whose ends, or you can say bases, are congruent parallel rectangular figures, right, rectilinear figures. So you can clearly see that prism actually is a 3D figure who has got some height. Now if I have to show you a diagram and if I have to show you how a prism is made, so see, it says, suppose we are making this is a square, let us take, right? So this says that the ends are squares and these are the lateral faces. So this is the kind of prism we are talking about, right? See, now what I have made is, this is a prism, right, in which all these faces, this top and bottom, are parallel, and these lateral faces, that is the standing faces, are what? Parallelograms. So let me show you how a prism actually looks like. Let me show you a type of prism. So you can clearly see these both figures are prism. Now you can see the first figure, that is figure number A. We have actually a hexagon. We have actually a hexagon as what? As a base. So see, the base is also a hexagon, the top is also a hexagon. So these both are called bases. So this is also a base, this is also a base. And these are the lateral faces, that is the standing faces. You can clearly see that these all are rectangles. Okay, this kind of prism is called actually a right prism, because all of the angles of the lateral sides are 90 degree, and this is called an oblique prism. But again, in this also all the bases, both the bases are actually parallel to each other, right? In this case the base is actually a pentagon, not an hexagon. You can clearly see that 1 2 3 4 and 5. So the base and top both are what? Pentagons. And this is an oblique prism. Why oblique? Because they are parallel but they are not right angle. You can clearly see that the angle between the sides and this particular base is not 90 degree. Okay, we are going to define what are regular and right prism, but now you can clearly understand. Okay, it does not mean that we only have hexagonal prism or pentagonal. We do have square, triangular prism. Okay, so we are going to classify them on the basis of these ends. So these bases basically are called ends of a prism, right? And they both are parallel. So this is what the introduction of prism looks like. So prism is a figure whose side faces you can see are parallelograms and the ends are parallel rectilinear figures. Okay, so let us move on and talk about what is a base of prism. Okay, as we have I told you what is a base, so let me define it formally. So the end on which a prism may be supposed to stand is called the is called the base of the prism. You can clearly see the end of a prism, or you can say the end on which a prism may be supposed to stand is called the base. Now if I show you in this figure, it is standing on this face, but if you turn upside down, then this top face will become a base. So that is why they both can be called bases. Then similarly, what is height of a prism? The perpendicular distance between the ends of a prism is called the height of the prism. Right. So you can clearly see the perpendicular distance between the ends of a prism. Now if I have to show you what base and height looks like in a particular prism, so let me show it with the help of a figure. Now in this particular case, if we talk about the base, then this is base, this is also base, right? If I have to talk you about the height, then the distance, this perpendicular distance from one base to another is called height. Okay, suppose, so if I have to give this figure a name, then it can be, let me give it A, let it be B, C, D, E and F. Okay, then A, B, C, D, E, F is a base. Similarly, let me give it P, Q, R, S, T, U. P, Q, R, S, T, U will be another base. If I have to talk about height, then DT would be height because it is a right prism. Okay, right prism. So all the sides are perpendicular. So EU can be height. You can say FP, you can say BR, AQ, CS, DT, EU. So all of these are called height of the prism. So this was all about the base and height, and you can clearly see that actually the base is a planar figure. Okay, and on the basis of base, this prism is called hexagonal prism because it is having hexagon as its ends. Okay, now let us talk about axis and length of the prism, right? So what is axis and what is length? See, these are the parameters on the basis of which we actually judge a prism. That what are the specifications, what is axis, what is length, what is base, what are the edges, what kind of faces do it have. Okay, so let us define that what is axis. The straight line joining the centers of the ends of a prism is called the axis of the prism. So straight line joining the centers of the ends of the prism. Now you can clearly see if axis we have to draw, then it actually means that we are talking about the ends, right? The bases. What are the ends? The center of ends means center of bases. Okay, so if you join the bases, center of the bases together, then it will form a straight line, which would be kind of parallel to the length only, because parallel to the height if it is a right circular prism, not right circular prism. And if it is not a right prism, if it is an oblique prism, then it will be somewhat inclined. Let me show you with the help of a figure that what actually axis of a prism look like. In this figure, if you talk about this center, so you can see the center of ends are this. So if I join them by a straight line, this would be the axis. Let me name it O and let me name it O dash. Then O dash would be the axis. Now you can clearly see if I talk about height. So height of the prism is also parallel to axis because this is a right prism, right? If it has been an oblique prism, then it would be somewhat like this. Right. So it would be at particular angle, then this would be the axis if we join the centers, right? So you can clearly see height would be like this, axis would be like this, so they would not be parallel. Okay, so that was the axis. Now let us talk about what is length of prism. Okay, what is length? Now if I have to talk about length, then the length of prism, the length of a prism is the portion of the axis that lies between the parallel ends, right? So the length of a prism is a portion of the axis that lies between the parallel ends. Now what parallel ends means? Parallel ends means the opposite bases which we are talking about. Now length is not length should not be confused with the height. Okay, let me recall, length should not be confused with the height, because here in this right prism this is the length. Okay, this is the length, because if you talk about length it will be OO dash only. If we talk about length it will be OO dash, and axis would also be OO dash, right? But because it is a right prism, you can talk about a length and height as a synonym. But if I take you to this figure, in this particular figure, now let me show you. Now what will be the axis? This straight line would be the axis, right? What would be length? This line. You can see, I told you that length of a prism is the portion of axis, so this would be length. So basically length of the axis is called the length of the prism, right? In this case you can clearly see this is the axis. Okay, this would be the axis, and if you talk about length, height and axis would be same. Here axis and its length would be length, but if you talk about height, then height would be like this. This would be height. So that is the difference, right? It is an oblique prism. If I have to write, it is an oblique prism, and this will be the right prism. So you can clearly see this is a right prism, this is an oblique prism, so height and length would be different over here. Okay, so if you talk about axis of the prism, then axis will be the centers joining the opposite ends. If you talk about length of the prism, then length would be the length of the axis. Now in this case, length of the axis and height would be same, right? You can call it length or height, but in the case of oblique prism, they would be different. Okay, now let us talk about lateral faces and lateral edges. Okay, let us talk about lateral face and lateral edge. So what will be lateral face? All faces, we have already seen that there are two faces called ends or bases. So all faces other than base. All faces other than the bases of a prism are known as its lateral faces. Okay, all faces other than the bases of prism are known as lateral faces. That is the standing faces. Okay, on the basis of which we were calling a prism as lateral, or we are calling a prism as a regular, or you can say right prism or the oblique prism. Okay, so right and oblique we were calling on the basis of lateral faces. Okay, if the lateral face is perpendicular, we were calling it to be right prism. Okay, so that was the lateral faces. I'll show you with the help of figure. And what are the lateral edges? The lines of intersection, of the lateral faces of a prism are called the lateral edges of the prism. Okay, so the lines of intersection of lateral faces of a prism are called the lateral edges. Now if I have to show you what are these lateral faces or what are the lines of intersection, so with the help of figure we can say, let's see, these are the lateral faces, these are the standing faces. Now this is a pentagonal prism because the end is a pentagon. So there are 5 rectangles. In this case they are rectangles. These rectangles are lateral faces, and these white lines which you are seeing where the 2 lateral faces are meeting, these are lateral edges, right? Lateral edges. And you can obviously see that other 2 faces are the base. Bases are obviously pentagons over here. So what is a lateral face? Lateral face is this particular standing side, and lateral edges are these white lines. So they are, if I have to recall, there are 5 lateral faces, and if we have to see, then there are 5 lateral edges, okay, standing line segments. So these were the you can call it the features of a prism, or you can call about the specifications of a prism, what we have to see in a prism. There can be lateral faces, lateral edges, bases, or length. Okay, so here you can clearly see that there are 5 lateral and 2 base, so there are total 7 faces in this. We will talk about that how many faces do a 3D figure have, what is the relation between them, as we have already seen that if we add certain faces, vertices, edges, we do get a formula, right? So we'll see about it. It is called Euler's relation. But now for the time being, see that the bases, the end base have 5 sides. Okay, it is a pentagon and it has got 7 faces. Okay, now let us talk about what is regular prism. Okay, we are going to see right prism as well, but what is regular prism? As we know that regular polygons were the polygons in which sides were equal, all the interior angles were equal. So what is a regular prism? So we'll define it in the terms of polygons only. A prism is called a regular. A prism is called a regular prism if ends are regular polygons, right? A prism is called a regular prism if ends are regular polygons, right? So now if we have to talk about regular prism, you can clearly see that in this particular prism the ends is a triangle. It is a regular polygon, so it must be an equilateral triangle, because we know that in triangles regular triangle is equilateral triangle only. So this particular figure is a regular prism, right? This base, this is a what? Regular triangle. Regular triangle, right? There's also regular triangle. So you can clearly see that regular triangle is basically equilateral. Similarly, if this pentagonal prism is regular prism, then this must be regular. This must be regular pentagon. Okay, it is an hexagon, so it is a regular hexagonal prism, right? There are 6 sides, so it would be regular hexagon. So now you can clearly see regular hexagon means this, all the 6 sides must be equal. So if the ends are regular, then the prism would be regular only. And you can also over there also, I would recall you something that, see, all the other 3 lateral faces are rectangles. Here there would be 6 lateral faces like this, and they are all rectangles if you see. Okay, so this was all about regular prism. Now let us talk about what is right prism. So if I have to talk about right prism, we have already talked about it a bit when we have seen some figures, as I told you in the starting of the lecture, that there is something called right and there is something called oblique. Okay, in which there is some angle between the lateral faces and the bases. So let us formally define it. What do we mean by a right prism? Okay, a prism is called a right prism if its lateral angles, if its lateral edges, as I told you, lateral edges are perpendicular. Okay, if its lateral edges are perpendicular to its ends. Okay, that is bases. So you can clearly see that lateral edges would be perpendicular to the base, simply means that lateral face is also perpendicular. Okay, so then it will be called a right prism. Otherwise, as I already told you, it is said to be an oblique prism. Okay, if I have to show you with the help of figures, I can show you that, see, this is a right prism, this is an oblique. I already showed you them multiple times. So in this, see, I also told you that in right prism, height is a lateral edge. See, this was the length and this was only the height, because the axis would be, this axis would be parallel to these lateral edges, right? Simple. So height, length, axis would be same. Here this axis would be at an angle. Okay, axis is again parallel to the lateral edges. I am not denying that. Okay, you can clearly see that lateral edges are also at angle. So axis would be at an angle and length would be the length of this particular axis. But height here, see, you can clearly see height is an altitude outside the prism, and height is obviously would be different than the length. So this would be the axis and this would be the length only. So if I have to show you this, this would be, that is the length of this axis would be length of prism. Okay. So it is a right prism. So you can clearly see that both the bases are parallel here also and here also. Both the base and ends are parallel. But in this particular case, every lateral edge, or you can say lateral face, also is perpendicular to the base. But here the lateral edges and bases, they have some angles. Okay. So let us move on and let us talk about a bit that what are the different features of right prism. Okay. So if I have to write you about the right prism, then you can clearly see in a right prism, the obvious thing is, in a right prism, length of the prism is same as its height. So you can clearly see that in right prism, length and height are same only, but in the case of oblique they are different, and that is why we are writing like that. Okay, all lateral edges are of the same length, equal to the height of the prism. Okay, all lateral edges are of the same length and they are all equal to the height of the prism. So right, so actually the length of this lateral edge is also called length of the prism. I already told you that axis and length of the edges are same only, right, in the case of prism. So it is like that only. Also another thing is that all lateral faces of a right prism, I am not talking about oblique but right prism, all lateral faces of a right prism are rectangles, as I showed you in a previous figure. All lateral faces of a right prism are rectangles. If I cross check, you can clearly see that this particular, if I give it a name, let it be A, B, C, D, you can clearly see that A, B, C, D would not be a rectangle, right? In the case of right prism, they must be rectangle, right? So they must be rectangle. Okay, so you can clearly see that these are rectangles. So it is a very important property, this particular property, that they all are rectangles. They are used many times in the questions when we have to solve some questions based on right prism. Then right prism and its lateral faces are rectangles. This property is of very much importance. Okay. Also, one more thing is that is very important in the from the question point of view, is that the number of lateral edges and lateral faces of a prism is same as the number of sides in the base of the prism. Right, this property also I have showed you. Right, see here the base is pentagon has 5 sides, so you can count 5 lateral faces, 5 sides. Here also pentagon has 5 sides, so 5 lateral faces, 5 lateral edges. Okay, so had it been hexagon, then there would be 6 lateral faces, 6 lateral edges. Okay, so it does not matter that whether it is a right prism or oblique prism, but for both the prism it is equally applicable. That is why I have written here prism, not right prism. Okay, so this is a property which is a property of prism. Okay, now let us talk about some specific type of prism, and let us study that how many edges, vertices and faces do they have with the help of figures. Okay, so the first one is triangular prism. Okay, and we are going to study about right prisms only. Okay, because they are of more importance. So if I have to talk about triangular prism, I can write a prism, very simple. On the basis of base, I can define a prism which has a uniform triangular cross section, is called a triangular prism. A prism which has a uniform triangular cross section is called a triangular prism. Okay, obviously if it have a triangular cross section, then the base is triangular, which has actually 3 sides. So I can write on the basis of that also that it will have 3 lateral faces. Okay, and it will have 2 bases. So on the basis of 3 lateral faces, I can write there are 6 vertices. Okay, 6 vertices, 9 edges total, and 5 faces. As I told you, see, 2 of the face will form triangle, and since there are 3 sides in a triangle, so there must be 3 lateral faces. So you can clearly see, and they will have 3 lateral edges, right? So this will be the specification: 6 vertices, 9 edges, and 5 faces. If I have to divide them, it will be 2 bases. Obviously, there will be 2 bases, and it will be 3 lateral faces. Lateral face of 3, similarly lateral edge. If I have to show you the figure, you can clearly see that these are triangular prisms. And if I have to show you the features, this would be the base, this would be lateral face. Okay, now you can count the edges. 3 must be this. If I have to give it name, then it must be O, A, B, C, D, E. Now if you count OA, BC and ED, these are 3 lateral edges, and similarly OB, OE and EB, AD, AC and DC, these are total 9 edges, 3 lateral and then 6 edges from these bases. Similarly 5 face, if you have to count vertex, okay, so how many vertices would be there? E, B, C, D, A, no, 6 vertices. If we have to count faces, there will be total 5 faces. Okay, so with the help of diagram, you can clearly see this is a triangular prism. The ends are triangular. Okay, and since the triangle has 3 sides, so there are 3 rectangles which will form lateral surfaces. Okay, let us move on to the next type of prism, which is rectangular prism. Now rectangular prism is nothing new, it is cuboid only. Okay, you must imagine, see, rectangular prism means that the bases are rectangle and the faces are already rectangles. We have already discussed that faces are already rectangles in a right prism. The ends are also rectangles, so it would be a cuboid. Okay, so I can write a prism which has uniform rectangular cross section is called a rectangle prism, right? A prism which has uniform rectangular cross section is called a rectangle prism. Similarly, if I have to talk about its particular specification, then you know that cuboid has total 8 vertices, right? Obviously it will have 12 edges. We have already talked about them, and there will be 6 faces. 4 because of the 2 are the bases and 4 are the lateral faces, so there must be 6 faces. Again, there are 2 base and 4 would be the lateral faces, because there are 4 sides in a cuboid. If I have to show you a figure and then explain what is a cuboid, then I can show this, and you can clearly see that this is what. If I take this as a base, then it must be base. This is a lateral face, right? And now you can clearly see it will have length, breadth and height. They would be the basically edges. So you can count that if I give it name, it would be O, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So if you see O, A, B, C and D, E, F, G are the bases in this situation, right? Similarly, all the standing 4 faces are the lateral faces. You can see that there are total 12 edges: OA, AB, BC, OC, DE, EF, FG, GD, and then GC, DO, BF and AE. These are 12 edges, and there are 8 corners, so 8 vertices, that is ABCO, DEFG, right? So you can clearly see that there are total 8 corners. So this was all about rectangular prism. Now let us move on to a square prism. Okay, so what is a square prism? Similarly, you can define it on the basis of n, that a prism which has a uniform squared cross section is called a prism which has a uniform squared cross section is called a square prism, right? Is called a square prism. Now you can clearly see that uniform cross section. What is cross section? Basically, cross section means the thickness. Okay, the area, base area is basically called the cross section. Okay, so you can clearly see that it should have square as a base, but the lateral faces still would be rectangles, right? So if I have to talk about specification again, it is similar to kind of cuboid only. Okay, so if I have to talk about number of edges would be what? Number of edges would be here also 12, right? If I have to talk about number of faces, it would again be 6, and if I have to talk about number of vertices, then it would be 8 only, right? There would be 6 faces, because see, the base is square which has 4 sides, so 4 lateral faces and 2 the bases are already there, 12 edges and similarly 8 vertices, right? So if I have to show you what a square prism look like, it looks like this. Now you will confuse it with the cuboid, so it is a cuboid only, but you can clearly see that cuboid is something in which all the faces are rectangles, right? You should remember that. It is a square prism. So in general, cuboid is what? Cuboid is something in which all the faces must be rectangles. Then now there are these 2 yellow faces are squares. These are squares, right? So if I have to name it, then it would be O, A, B, C, and D, E, F, G, right? So there are again 12 edges: AO, OC, CB, AB, then ED, DG, GF and FE, then AE, BF, DO and GC. These are 12 edges. There are 8 vertices which are 8 corners, and similarly there are 6 faces. Okay, so this was all about square prism. Then again, see, we started with rectangular prism, which is basically cuboid, in which all of them are rectangles. Now we have made 2 bases as squares. Now if I made all the bases are squares, then that particular kind of figure will also be a prism, but it would be cube. Okay, so cube you can call it a special type of square prism in which even the lateral faces are also squares, because every square is a rectangle also, right? every rectangle is not a square, but every square is a rectangle also. So you can write a square prism, whose all faces, a square prism whose all faces are squares, is called a cube, right? So a square prism whose all faces are squares is called a cube. Now you can clearly see that in this cube, all the faces, even the lateral faces are squares. Again, it will have 8 vertices, 12 edges and 6 faces. Okay, so we have already studied about cube. So this was all about cube. Now you can clearly see the length, breadth and height of a cube are same only, which we take as the side of the cube. Now the last type of prism we can talk about is a pentagonal prism, right? So as from the name, you can identify that pentagonal prism is basically a prism which has uniform pentagonal cross section. That is the base should be pentagon, which has a pentagonal cross section, which has uniform pentagonal cross section, is called pentagonal prism, right? Now if I have to talk about its vertices, number of sides, then number of vertices would be what? See, let us count the number of vertices without the figure. Now see, in pentagonal there must be 5 sides, right? So there must be 5 lateral faces, so 5 corners above and 5 corners below, so there must be 10 vertices. If I have to talk about number of faces, then again it would be how much? Now let us talk about, there must be 2 bases, always we have 2 bases in a prism. Then there must be 5 lateral faces, because lateral faces and number of lateral edges are actually equal to the number of sides in the base, which is pentagon, so it is 5. So there must be 7 total number of faces. If I have to talk about number of edges, okay, so it would be number of faces and number of edges, right? So they are also number of vertices and then number of faces. So if I have to talk about number of edges, then there must be 5 plus 5, 10 in the base and 10 in the top, that is 2 of the base, 5 in the base and 5 in the top. So there must be 10 edges which comprises of base. Then there must be 5 lateral edges, so there must be 15 edges in total, right? So we have calculated without the figure. Let us see what the figure says. Okay, so this is how a pentagonal prism looks like. So if I name it like this, let me name it O, A, B, C, D, then E, F, G, H, I. Then you can clearly see A, O, D, C, B and F, E, I, H, G. These are 2 pentagonal bases. Okay, so this must be base. And then there are 5 standing, that is 5 lateral faces. So there must be 7 faces. Now let us talk about the vertices. Now A, O, B, C, D, 5 vertices at the top, F, E, I, H, G, 5 vertices at the bottom. So there must be 10 vertices. And similarly, if we count the edges, then OA, OB, OA, OD, DC, BC and AB. These are 5 edges on the top. FE, EI, IH, HG and FG. These are 5 edges in the bottom. And then AF, BG, CH, DI and OE. These are 5 edges in the lateral faces. Okay, so we can see there are 15 edges. Okay, so these are the types of prisms, like pentagonal prism, triangular prism, square prism. Okay, now you must be knowing everything about prism. Now you can calculate the axis, you can calculate the length, you can see what is the height. Okay, you can identify that whether a prism is right or it is oblique, whether it is regular or irregular. Okay, so this was all about the prism. So I hope you all understand what is the prism, what is the concept of prism and how actually to identify different types of prism. This was all about this lecture. We'll meet in the next lecture. Till then, goodbye.